Hello and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me for another weekly worm update. I have 4 working worm systems, 2 regular totes, 2 Vermi bag totes, and then 1 Vermi bag mini. This is the first of my 2 regular totes, and what I'm working on with the totes is increasing the volume for the final harvest and dealing with excessive moisture in the bins. Over the summer, the moisture built up a lot. The castings were kind of wet. So my focus here was trying to see how I could dry out the castings or keep them drier without over drying the bin. Right now, it was suggested that I try a fan on the bins, and the castings in the upper part, which is the area that was not fed last week, dried quite a bit. The castings where the worms actually are, I have one of my first worm balls here, a pretty good worm ball. They're over in the wetter castings, which I know that the worms do prefer the wetter castings than the drier castings, but just in terms of managing the bin, and you can see the difference in consistency from top and bottom, but just in terms of managing the bin for myself, I don't like the bins to be too wet because it can very easily tip into really muddy and really heavy castings. So I try to find that sweet spot, which is very elusive. When it comes to tending to worms, it's like every week you're trying to fix what you did the week before. You're always reacting. So this week what I'm doing is putting the cardboard underneath the food because I am giving wetter food. I'm doing a bit of a smaller feeding, but I want to see if putting the cardboard under the food will help soak up some of the moisture. It is still unseasonably warm for September in my area, so I am still battling humidity more so than I would be. But I am going to just see how putting the food on top of the cardboard will work, as well as keeping that fan directed to the 4 bins as well. And that will complete the update for the first bin. With the second bin, this bin is the one that is drier than the other bin. My 2 bins, even though they're in the same area and get fed pretty much the same, do have different environments. So this one is the one that's a bit drier than the other. And in the area where I didn't feed, it was a little too dry, surprisingly enough. But overall, I still don't see any evidence that the worms are trying to escape on the outside. Those tracks that you see with the castings behind them let you know that your worms are crawling around, and sometimes that's indicative of them being unhappy. But I haven't seen signs of that in quite some time. And overall, the castings in this bin seem pretty good. I think this is one of the first times in a while that I was really satisfied and didn't want to do any changes in the bin. Here's another example of the consistency in the bin. But this is one of the first times in a while where I didn't really want to make any type of corrections in one of the regular totes. So I'm just pulling up all of the castings, and I do this very gently. I'm just using like the tips of my fingers. I'm not really using my whole palm to move around the castings, as I don't want to disturb or damage any of the worms. Now in this bin, because it was drier, I didn't put the cardboard under the food. I still kept the feeding a little bit smaller, but in this bin, I am going to distribute the cardboard on top to see if that makes a difference really in the bin with the next feeding. And then after I've added the cardboard, this will update this bin for the next week as well. Moving over to the first of my Vermi bag totes. This particular one was harvested around the same time as the 2 regular totes, which was about a month before the second Vermi bag tote that I have. This colony is doing very well, and I have a good size worm ball for the worms in here. They're hanging out where the food is. Overall, the consistency of the castings feel pretty good, although it is holding more moisture than I would expect for a vermi bag tote. Vermi bags are made to have the moisture evaporate from the sides. And again, I do think it's just from the unseasonably hot weather that we've had. I've been dealing with issues with humidity. Overall, I again am impressed with the casting quality and just how the bin is moving forward. So I'm going to add more cardboard to this one to increase the material. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with my first regular tote, which is put the food on top of the cardboard and not wet the cardboard down, in hopes that it will soak up some of that moisture. And then the size feeding for this bin is more of a regular size feeding. I'm not holding back on this one. I feel like the worms are eating what I put into it. And if I do have extras left over, I can always skip a week. It's not a problem to do that and just put in some worm grit. But that updates this bag for the next week. Now this one is the Vermi Bag Mini that I had the colony that disappeared. I can't even say collapsed, it just disappeared. For this bin, I am going to be testing some ways to increase the colony size in the upcoming weeks. I just want to make sure I have the right materials to do that. But for this bin, I don't think I'm going to be harvesting it anytime soon. I really don't want to disturb the worms too much. So I'm focusing on giving them small feedings and just making sure the health of the worms is at the forefront. They do seem to be doing pretty good, but there's a lot of leftover food in this bin, so they're definitely not breaking down the food as fast as the other bins. So this week I'm going to put the cardboard in the actual castings because they felt a little too damp to me. And once I mix it in really well, I'm going to put the food scraps that were left behind in and just give a small little bit of fresher food to that before covering it back up with the grit and the bubble wrap. So not much going in this bin for this week, just focusing on maintaining some happy, healthy worms. And the update for this bin is complete for the next week. The last and final bin is the Vermi Bag Mini, my only flow-through system, which I have been putting to the test the last couple of weeks. Here's a nice happy worm. I've been putting this bin to the test the past couple of weeks by how much food I can put into it and how much moisture it holds. I haven't done a actual camera shot of the bin, but the bin underneath is empty. It's just collecting dust at the bottom. So I haven't had any castings come through. Once I harvest this, I will be looking forward to seeing whether the castings are damp, whether that moisture is just going into the bottom and evaporating, or whether the castings at the bottom are holding on to it. But I do have quite a bit of potworms and beetles now. So I did have large feedings the last 2 weeks, and although the bin can handle it, the population of beetles did explode, and I don't really like the beetles or potworms. So I'm going to put some diatomaceous earth and eggshells down first. That helps with the beetle and potworm colonies. Then I'm going to put cardboard down, and then I'm going to put food in the cardboard for the worms to get them to move forward. Hopefully doing the feeding this way will prevent some of those beetles from reproducing and overtaking the bin. I know some people don't care, but it's just a personal preference for me. I don't like putting my hands down and pulling out a handful of beetles with everything. So the feeding itself is not going to be as large of a feeding because there still are a lot of food particles. And although the bag doesn't smell, the castings never smell sour. The one time they smelled sour, I had actually put cabbage in, which I would not recommend putting cabbage in because it gets stinky, cabbage and broccoli. But the bin doesn't smell sour. It just has a larger pest population. So I'm going to cut back on the food this week, but I am going to water the bin very well to make sure that it doesn't dry out on the top. I probably should have watered that other level of the cardboard, but we'll see what happens since it is really wet on the other side. And that completes the update. Thank you so much for sticking to the end. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.